All right, we got another 5 sheet today from the Gateway Pundit. So let's remember the 5 sheet is an objective document which anyone can fill out for any news article according to your own knowledge and your own biases to cut through all of the disinformation, all of the fakery, all of the tricks they might use to try to put something past you. So, this is just an example of how I filled out this particular article to give a little insight on how we use this tool. Let's get started. The headline is They Write It, Not Making Headlines. More involvement on China's involvement. Sorry. Not making headlines. More information on China's involvement in the 2020 US election. Now, is that title a fact or opinion? I said that's a fact, and I paraphrased it. There is more information on China's involvement in the 2020 elections, which is not making headlines. So, what's the bias of this outlet or author? I said it's definitely a right leaning outlet, Gateway Pundit, and Joe Hoft is one of the core authors there, very much on the right. Let's find the thesis. It's right at the beginning here. We know China was involved, we, the Gateway Pundit, they know that China was involved in the US 2020 election and the fraud that ensued. So I said that's an opinion. And the way I paraphrased it, it is known that China was involved in the election and that there is more evidence. So the way they phrase it, it sounds kind of like a fact because they're saying we know, and you can maybe say that's we the authors know, but I think the way they're intending it to be read is more like we the people, we everybody know. And that is definitely a debatable point. So that's why I wrote that as an opinion. If you read it the other way, I think that's more of a fact, because that's just a claim that they're making. All right. What evidence do they have supporting that thesis? They have this one study they talk about here. This study here from 2019 that says 1 in 5 parts from the US voting machines were made in China. And the other piece is this quote from the Overstock founder, Patrick Byrne, talking about how China had hacked the voting machines, how information was being sent back there, and whatnot. Alright, let's run through the outline of this article, see how it was structured. Started out with that thesis right at the beginning. They then talked about how China owns this French company that designed some devices that were used in the Dominion machines. They don't have any citations here, so I don't know exactly what that's based on. They then talk about the 1 in 5 parts being made in China, have that study. Then move on to that part with Patrick Byrne, talk about how information is being sent back to China, talk about, how he claims that's documented, the information he believes that supports that. And finally, they have this little clip or little bit at the bottom saying that China was involved and nobody seems to care. So that's the overall structure of the article. Now let's look at the name deception tactics, and there were quite a few. Starting out with statistics lacking context. We'll hit the definition of that. Statistics are easily manipulable to make misleading points. They are fairly used if presented with enough context and simplicity that 5th graders could understand them without much disagreement, or if they're presented with advocates present to argue the case on both sides, like the way lawyers would in a courtroom. Let's see the way they do it here. This is from the study that said 1 in 5 machines, or 1 in 5 parts for the voting machines were made in China. And then they hit you with this wall of stats. 20%, so that's the 1 in 5. And then 56% of the first 3 tiers had at least one location in China. 14% of suppliers within the first 3 tiers, and that one was Russia. 59% of companies within the first 3 tiers had, so and that's China, Russia, or China and Russia. So I don't even know what these first 3 tiers are. They don't explain that anywhere. That's maybe explained in this link somewhere. But I don't think they expect most people to go through and follow that link, really break down all of these stats, figure out exactly what they're saying there. I think they expect most of the readers of this to look at that and say, wow, China had a ton of involvement. Look at all those stats. That's usually why people put these big walls of stats in lay-facing news articles like this. All right, next one up, poison the well. Very first sentence of this article, we know China was involved in 2020 election and the fraud that ensued. So that just states the conclusion before offering any evidence, and it colors everything that comes after it. So definition of poison the well. When an author aims to discredit a source of information instead of assessing the credibility of that information, and that can be done productively, like if someone has a history of reporting false fires and they come to you reporting a fire, you might think maybe this one's false, but it's usually done in a more manipulative way. The defendant falsely denies murdering those people before explaining the defendant's story, his side of the argument. So here it's just saying what the conclusion is. Everything that comes after it is going to be colored through the lens of that conclusion, especially if you're someone who tends to be on board with what these people are saying. And the Gateway Pundit is an outlet that there's not a lot of left-wing people who read this. There's not even too many centrists who read this. It's mostly targeted to right-wing audience. So most of the people who read this article are going to agree with this conclusion. So when you hit them with that at the very beginning, that primes them and that colors everything that comes after it. Alright, next one up, straw man feigning ignorance. So, anytime an author omits a material fact or a relevant argument from a conversation. What they did here, Patrick Byrne, the claim he made, there was a lot of talk about China hacking into these machines. And he gets into technical detail about China, getting into a wireless card and the IPs. And there's a little video embedded in here talking about the Internet of Things and, the Microsoft certified technician they had that ran through all this. So there's a lot of details about China hacking into these machines. But nowhere in there is an allegation about them inserting anything into the machines. It's all about the information being sent back to China. And, maybe that would... So if those allegations are true, maybe that would be to spy on our election process, which would be a bad thing. But it's different from them flipping the election, which seems to be what they're implying here. And they don't address that distinction in this article. So that strikes me as some kind of straw man feigning ignorance. They're not addressing the whole argument there. And the last one here, undue emotion. Let's find that. When a reader is highly emotional, they are comparatively less rational. Some stories will necessarily increase the emotionality of a reader, but often news people insert undue emotion into a story with personal anecdotes, loaded language, and so on. So any undue emotion should be treated with suspicion. Where they do it is this final sentence. China was involved in the 2020 election, but for some reason, the US justice system, media, courts, politicians, and intel agencies just don't seem to give a damn. So that's some loaded language right there. Almost feels like a call to action, and it was likely written that way to drum up the emotions in the readers in an unnecessary way. So that's a manipulation tactic. That's undue emotion. All right, moving on to the final section here. What's the big picture stuff? What were they trying to do with this article? It seemed to be arguing the point that China interfered in the election on behalf of Joe Biden without ever directly saying that. I mean, look at the graphic they have at the top, China Joe. And all the stuff they have is about China being involved in the election. That's all the text they have. They don't say China moved votes towards Biden, anything like that. But there's definitely an implication of that. This graphic is a good example of that. And when you're catering to an almost exclusively right-wing audience, they're already gonna want to be looking for that. In this environment right now, where there's still a lot of people disputing this election, where people have talked about these Dominion voting machines and stuff, you don't have to come out and say that China was helping Biden. If this audience hears that China was involved in the election, they're going to assume it was to benefit Joe Biden. So that seemed to be what they were arguing. And the way they did it, there was a lot of previously reported information here. We reported in early December. And then this second piece of information they have is from December 2019. So it's a lot of old news mixed in with a little bit of new news just to try to argue this point. Just to try to imply that Biden was the beneficiary of China's involvement. Alright, so that's what I got on this article. Seems like it was a fairly manipulative piece overall. Not a super long article, but might have been some stuff I missed in here. So feel free to run your own 5-sheet on it, or put some in the comments if you think I missed anything. Also, feel free, if you have a story you'd like me to run a 5-sheet on, drop that in the comments and I will take a look at it. Thanks a lot, guys. I'll see you next time.